All right. Welcome to an introduction on World War II. We'll be looking at the beginnings of World War II today and the broad overview of World War II. So, as you can see on the title slide that we're starting, if you're following along at home with your PowerPoint, that we're going to cover some key terms today, so make sure that you're familiar with them. So you'll notice the title of the class today is The Good War. This is a nickname that World War II gets. It comes from oral history of World War II by scholar Studs Terkel. And this refers to the fact that many Americans felt that World War II was the rare example of a war that was truly good. Now, this may seem weird to you because, well, we generally view war as bad, right? It's destructive, it causes the loss of life. However, many people have a lot of nostalgia for World War II. So let's dig into why this is. For many people, World War II is seen as a good war because it was an example of where the United States was seen as the very clear good guy, right? We were fighting on the right side of history versus a very clear evil. We tend to think of Nazis and Adolf Hitler as our key example of evil, but as we're going to talk about in this section, the Japanese were initially the target of American ire and anger over their attack on Pearl Harbor. And if you look at later conflicts that the United States engages in militarily after World War II, then you start to see why people are so attracted to this clear good versus clear evil. Because the United States will get involved in places like Korea in the early 1950s in a conflict that still technically isn't over. They never formally signed a peace treaty. In Vietnam throughout the 1960s and early 70s, although as we'll talk about later this semester, we start getting involved in Vietnam as early as the 1950s. And that, again, didn't really end well from the American perspective. We'll later get involved in places like the Persian Gulf, and we're still, as of 2020 at least, involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, in places that we've been at war and had troops for now 2 decades. So when you look at the track record of the United States post World War II, the conflicts that we get in are far messier and longer and very, my apologies for the noise, very clearly ambiguous. Were we on the right side when we were fighting Vietnam? Because that conflict started with the Vietnamese trying to gain independence from France. And we'll talk about how we got dragged into that a little bit later. Part of the nostalgia factor then is explained by what scholars call victory culture. So in other words, because the United States later on is so concerned, right, with the fact that we are no longer seeing around the world as a clear good guy, that we have ambiguous ends to some of these conflicts we're involved in, that we therefore cling really hard to World War II as proof that even if the later conflicts we're involved in are messy, at least our heart's in the right place, right? That we have good intentions. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you might remember at the very beginning of the film showing an elderly man who's at a cemetery in Normandy where those who died during the D-Day invasion are buried, and he collapses to the ground and he asks his wife, "Have I lived a good life?" Right? Trying to kind of get reassurance that his survival, his intentions in fighting this war were good, and that the outcome of this war was worth it to his perspective. So we're going to talk about how World War II was not all sunshine and roses and kittens, that this nostalgia that we remember World War II by oftentimes is colored by rose-colored glasses. So in other words, this tendency to remember World War II fondly oftentimes makes it harder for us to see what the historical reality actually was. As we're going to talk about, there's a lot of disruptions in the United States during World War II. Not everybody puts aside their differences and works together for the war to come to a successful conclusion. And if anything, it's all the more impressive that the United States manages to be on the winning side of World War II, given all of the problems that we were dealing with on the home front. So World War II is seen as a very different kind of war. If World War I is the first truly global war, World War II took that global nature to a whole other level. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously stated, this war is a new kind of war. It is warfare in terms of every continent, every island, every sea, every air lane. So what Roosevelt is saying is, in part because of the evolving technology of war that had happened post-World War I, really the United States is no longer as isolated as it once was. In fact, as we're going to talk about during our coverage of World War II, the United States is not exempt from attack by enemy forces. Parts of Alaska are occupied by the Japanese for periods